Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Leah. I'm the WebEx producer, and I will be in the background answering WebEx technical questions. If you experience difficulties using the WebEx session, you may contact WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239 or type into the Q&A box and select WebEx producer in the Send To list, and I will do my best to assist you. As an attendee, you will be in a listen-only mode throughout the presentation, and being part of a large audience, the attendee list is not displayed due to privacy concerns. And to note, today's event is being recorded. We will be holding a live Q&A session after each speaker presents. Once we reach the Q&A slide, we will begin taking questions. To ask a question, please use the raise hand feature located below your name in the participants area of your screen. Your name will be announced. At that point, please note you will hear a beep in your line as the beep signifies you are being unmuted. With that said, I would now like to hand things over to Colby, who will be leading us off. Colby, please begin.
Hello, and welcome to the 9th installment of the State of 911 webinar series being presented by the National 911 Program. My name is Colby Rackwell, and I am support for the program. This webinar series was designed to offer 911 stakeholders information about ongoing federal and state 911 and NG 911 projects and provide real experiences and best practices from early adopters about the NG 911 transition process currently underway across the country. Each webinar consists of a presentation from a federal level and a state-level 911 stakeholder, with each being followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. If there is time remaining at the end of the event, we will open up the floor again to all questions. Following the event, a recording of the presentation along with the slides will be posted to the National 911 Program's website, www.911.gov. You can also visit the site to find information on past and future events, as well as to learn more about the National 911 Program. We will begin today's event with a presentation from DHS Office of Emergency Communications Technology Policy Strategist, Mr. Alex Kraling, who will focus on cybersecurity and NG 911. Following the Q&A with Mr. Kraling, Ms. Lynn Questel, Executive Director of the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board, will present on best practices and lessons learned in deploying a statewide NG 911 network. Now I'd like to hand it off to Ms. Lori Flaherty, Coordinator for the National 911 Program.
Thanks, Colby, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. We're really lucky today. We have a couple of what I think are wonderful speakers, and it is great fun for me to introduce the first one to you. Mr. Alex Kraling is a technology policy strategist in the Office of Emergency Communications at DHS. He is, frankly, one of the smartest people I know, and he was on the Hill for years before he came to DHS, so his Rolodex is worth millions. He is going to talk to us today about cybersecurity and NG 911. So, Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lori. I really appreciate it. It's good to be able to kind of find time to talk about the topic with people who are actually practitioners. It's a little bit rare, quite frankly, for us to have an opportunity to talk to people about something that is directly related to their organization, yet sometimes something that people may not know as well as they think that they might. And that topic for us today is cybersecurity. The way that we're going to contextualize this is about both cyber and physical security, and that's important, and we'll get into why in just a few moments. But Colby, if you could be kind enough to advance the slide, that'd be great. So what's this program? So what is DHS doing in cybersecurity? I think more importantly is the question. One of the things that we've done over the past couple of years in the area of cybersecurity, specifically for public safety and emergency communications, is to stand up this program we affectionately call Captain. And the idea of Captain is to understand and analyze the physical and cyber threats potential to the nationwide public safety broadband network, or NPSBN. While that might not seem entirely analogous to what we're going to be discussing today in 911, I can assure you that even though the network may be different, the attack surface is very similar. And to that extent, a lot of our analysis is very germane to our discussion. So what we've done previously is, since about the late 2012, we've been working with a number of bodies throughout the interagency, and those would include everyone from the Department of Justice, to friends at DOT, folks at the intelligence community, as well as the Federal Communications Commission and others, to develop a methodology that we could look at the potential risks associated with the deployment of broadband infrastructure with a specific use case of public safety. We provided a lot of these results to different boards. One of them would be a couple of boards at the Federal Communications Commission, as well as FirstNet for the deployment of the NPSBN. But if you'll advance the slide again, what I think we'll be able to start talking about is what those specific risks are and why they're really important to be able to understand. And then once we understand the risks, then we can attempt to take action to mitigate them. So while a lot of folks are already using digital technologies, whether it's in your data center or whether those technologies might enable things like land mobile radio, the deployment of broadband access and transport networks kind of changes the equation. And here's kind of how it does it. One of the ways that's enabled differently for the advancement of communications under broadband is the ability to transmit rich media services, right? And so for NG911, those rich media services might come in the form of not just a text message, but a multimedia message of some nature, sharing of a data file, and we're going to kind of keep it abstract, so many use cases are kind of germane here. But in the sharing of that information, what you're really doing is you're accepting bits and bytes of transcoded information, and in the coding of that information could be potential risks. We'll get into what those are a little bit later and give you some tools you might be able to use, as well as some vocabulary that hopefully will kind of help arm you in your discussions internally. But what's important to take away here is that both mobile and fixed networks are, quite frankly, vulnerable to cyber threats. This is not anything we don't know. The thing that's different between what might be like AT&T's network or a network for, a Department of Motor Vehicles network, even if it's using like MPLS, the network itself doesn't matter, it's the purpose that it's serving. So here in public safety, what we have is high-value targets, right, for hacktivist groups, for criminals, potentially for terrorists, as well as for organized crime, or just people who like to inject some chaos into our daily lives, which is oh so nice. The reason why it's important to start from the attack surface is because once you understand, what the potential threat actor looks like, you can start to understand how you may be able to safeguard your information, right? So if we'll move on to the next slide. What we'll start seeing here is a couple of key pieces of vocabulary you might be familiar with, but just to level set, I want to go over them again. So the Department of Homeland Security defines cyber risk as anything that would negatively impact security and resiliency of cyber infrastructure, right? So what we're really looking at here is something called the CIA triad, right? The confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, network systems, and services, right? So we're going to get into what CIA actually means in a little bit, but think about it this way. Confidentiality is somewhat analogous to privacy, insofar as people who are supposed to be able to access information are the only ones who are supposed to be able to see it. Integrity basically means that if I send Lori Flaherty an email, the way that I wrote it on my desktop or on my laptop is the exact way that it's received by Lori in Washington, D.C. And that's important because the ability for things to be unchanged is the ability for us to have trust in our communication systems. Availability functionally is the ability for that service to be there when you need it. And while these things might seem very high level, the CIA triad is kind of an underpinning for how we express risk. I think I've got a couple of questions on the, oh, nope, I'm wrong. Sorry about that. So to keep going, what we've got here underneath that is terminology around threats, vulnerabilities, likelihood, and consequence. So if we think about what a threat actor is, right, a threat actor could be, as I said before, like a hacktivist group or a potential terrorist, but it's also important to remember that these are just people. At the end of the day, there's no one who's going to walk around a PSAP or walk around a data center or, walk around in Times Square with a flag that says, "Hi, my name is Alex and I'm a threat actor," right? Which means that you don't necessarily have to be paranoid, but you should be cognizant that people who are working in or around infrastructure you may support may be either willingly or unwillingly part of that threat dynamic. It's known as insider threat. It's a lot more common than people think. I read a couple of articles on the target hacking. It's very likely that people who worked in or around the target enterprise were those people who executed the attack. And so thinking about people in terms of, what they have access to and what the vulnerability is of that access may be a good way of thinking about it in terms of addressing insider threat as well as understanding kind of those threat actors. So a vulnerability, this is obviously pretty simple, but a vulnerability is basically a network system or service that could be exploited. And an exploit is just a way of kind of getting in and turning the system against the people who are supposed to be using it. Likelihood is just a description of how often or what the chance of something happening is, and a consequence is really the event of occurrence. So before we get on to the next slide, what I think is important here is just to go through a quick dynamic. So the question that we're asking here is, what is the likelihood of a threat actor exploiting a vulnerability and causing a consequence that would be negative and impact your operation? And that's really the paradigm that we're looking through here when we kind of ask ourselves these questions. If you go to the next slide. So what does Captain Program do to assess these risks? So in 2012, we stood up this program, and in 2013, we identified 117 potential risks to broadband infrastructure related with the deployment of the nationwide public safety broadband network. And those risks fell into operability, cybersecurity, and resiliency. They really came in three categories: governance, policy, and planning, as well as network systems and services, so that would be more the digital infrastructure. And then there's the last piece, which is physical infrastructure. While not all of the report is germane to 911, a lot of it is, and the next slides that we're going to get into will show that. So if you could please advance. So what are potential cyber risks to 911, or rather NG911? Let's just kind of get into it. There was a GAO report that some of you were familiar with that states that there's more than 6,000 PSAPs that answered 24 million nationwide calls. It's interesting that that is one of the first things that we start with here, because what I think it speaks to is the disbursement of infrastructure and potentially the lack of overall control of that infrastructure. While people don't generally like to think of of control by another person as something that benefits them, control is just a word that we use to contextualize what we're trying to get at. What we're really trying to get at here is to make sure that we have evenly implemented services and policies across multiple networks that ensure that we are taking cybersecurity into not just perspective, but we're actually managing it, right? And why are we managing it? Well, one of the reasons is because that under an NG911 model, we have got a very changed attack surface from what we've had in the telephony age. So I'm sure a lot of you know about the TDOS, or the telephony denial of service attacks that occurred last year on a few PSAPs. Those are inherently different from what we're dealing with today. What those attacks did was attempt to target a specific piece of infrastructure and just basically keep the phone off the hook, for lack of a better term. It's an oversimplification of what happened. But here what you have is an opportunity for multiple networks and systems to be what's called botted. And that basically means that someone would install a client on a computer or a device of some nature, either a phone or a laptop or a desktop or a server or a router, and it would allow them to drone that, that piece of infrastructure in such a way that they can control its signaling. And what this would allow a threat actor to do is send a denial of service attack over that IP network, something called a send flood attack. And this basically would just send lots and lots of packets to an answering point, and in the doing of that, you would basically overwhelm the buffers on the infrastructure, and they would start dropping calls, right, or dropping bits and bytes and packets of data. And it's important to remember that that has a negative impact not just for denying the service to the infrastructure and making it unavailable, but it also has an extent to corrupt the fidelity of the information that you're receiving. Fidelity of information in the 911 community being extremely important, if for nothing else than to ensure that we have quality of service in the records management that we're keeping. And those, records oftentimes get turned over into court proceedings, or there are things that you would want to ensure that you'd be able to send out to first responders actually in the field, and not those public safety personnel only located in the PSAP. So the corrupting of data, the denial of data, those are two things that would impact operations. More than that, we have lots of hackers who seek thrills in different forms of activism, or people who, would like to try and engage some sort of attack to extract potentially, money from a PSAP. So how would that work? One of the things that we've done, I believe, in the TDOS attacks is known as ransomware, or not specifically for TDOS, but in an IP network, it would be ransomware where they would basically install malware on a system and would not release it until you paid them. And these would be obviously very harmful. And there's lots of reasons why malicious actors might want to engage this, and there's lots of different threat actors who of, profiling who these people might be. The last one to keep in mind of would be wiretapping or traffic hijacking. This would basically be a site redirect. It could come in the form of, I send you an MMS, and it contains a URL or JavaScript running in back, which automatically exits me out to the public internet, or to a specific site that could have corrupted information and could engage my systems. And if I didn't have appropriate mitigations in place, it could be very damaging for me. So without taking too much more time on that, if we want to move on to the next slide, I've got about 7 minutes left, and I kind of want to give you an overview of where we're going here. So from an overall public safety perspective, why is this important? So if we assume for a moment that either the NCSDN or the 911 network is, and I'm using sarcastic air quotes on some level, quote, secure, right? And I say that because there's really nothing that's secure. It's good to think of it in terms of resiliency, right? So I love boxing. I'm not a very good boxer, but I can take a hit in the face. And the reason why that's important is because your ability to do that and come back from it is your ability to maintain operations, right? So if either the 911 network or the NPSDN is secure, that is insufficient. And the reason why it's insufficient is because both are necessary components for the ability to manage emergency communication. Beyond that, the NG911 system being corrupted has the potentiality to impact, citizens who don't have any training, and that leads to real outcomes for chaos. It's important to bring up, though, that it's not only intentional threats that could interject any type of security risk here. Unintentional threats are also very common, and these would be things like misconfiguring a database, right, or misconfiguring a network, or putting in management policies that may not promote interoperability between PSAPs, right? These are all things that could happen unintentionally. So having a perspective on those both intentional and unintentional risks is very valuable. The ability for public safety to connect back into the PSAP is going to be predicated on their ability to trust that domain. And so that means that you need to have accountability and control of specific traffic. You need to have clear end-to-end lines of responsibility. And you need to be able to ensure the fidelity of information, or rather the integrity of it, to make sure that things like medical or legal records can be transmitted across an infrastructure. It's also important to note that even though you may secure your own domain of your PSAP, you're using other people's transport networks. So ensuring that you're using the right type of cryptography is important to ensure that you can use anyone's transport network, right? Making sure you're not sending any information in the clear, obviously very important. The other thing that's important is knowing that you have sufficient bandwidth by which you can either thwart a denial of service attack, because there's just so much bandwidth there it can't be overwhelmed, or that you'll have the opportunity to engage real-time services such as voice and video, either to receive those informations from citizenry or to put them out into the field and first responders. If we'll move to the next slide, please, Colby. Great. So what are our next steps, right? So one next step that I think we're going to have to take on as a community, I don't know necessarily if the Office of Emergency Communications is the only office to do this or necessarily the right one, though I believe that we are. Someone will really have to do a risk analysis on the 911 systems themselves. So we all understand IP communications, and we all understand that in an IP network where you are having peering points or interconnections with other networks to either accept traffic or to send traffic, that those are single points of failure, right? So an analysis of both the physical and virtual single points of failure, I think, will be increasingly important. For PSAPs, one next thing that might be important to look at would be the ability to, the extent to which information of a sensitive nature might be virtualized onto the same sort of database or server that non-sensitive information is retained on. Now, you can do that. It just depends on how you implement your management policy. So what I'm saying here is that what you're really going to want to do is perform a level of risk analysis in the deployment of new systems and services. One plug here for our colleagues at NIST. One thing that would, I think, behoove network managers would be to take a look at the NIST cybersecurity framework and see how it might relate to them, right? So if you're reporting FISMA, that is, basically one, one thing that would, be a flag for you to want to engage in this cybersecurity framework, and take a look at your both resiliency policies as well as your security policies. What type of intrusion detection service are you running? What type of intrusion prevention service are you running? How is your firewall configured, right? How's your firewall configured in such a way that you can take inputs from the public in terms of rich media services, pass that through a firewall, be able to analyze it in a contained and quarantined environment, and then take the information that's necessary and have that analyzed by somebody in a PSAP or send it out to a first responder in the field. So I guess that's kind of the big question, and there are a lot of unknowns in NG911, partially because this is kind of a brave new world for public safety. So what would be really helpful would be, I think, communicating to Lori and to other people, both at DOT and the FCC and the Department of Homeland Security, what you're finding in the world so that you can help us bring in great analysis into our work. So there are some backup slides. We'll just keep them as backup for Q&A, and I'm happy to move to questions.
All right, thank you, Alex. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A box if you'd like to read those.
Sure. So how does the NPSBN differ from the PSTN? We're all IP networks. Great question. So the PSTN, being the public switch telephone network, right, differs from Internet Protocol, and I think folks on the phone know that. This differs in a number of different ways, but PSTN is predominantly a circuit switch piece of infrastructure. IP networks are, packet switched infrastructure, lots of proceedings going on there at the Federal Communications Commission. What the NPSBN is the Nationwide Public Safety Broadband Network. So this is the quote, FirstNet network, and that network is generally thought of as the wireless front end of public safety communications. So this is an LTE network that is stood up under legislation. So it's the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, establishes FirstNet, and then as a governing authority inside the NTIA. And on the board of directors is a number of folks, including the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and the Director of OMB, and a number of folks in public safety and commercial industry. So that's a long answer to your question. I think the right answer to your question is the MTSBN is a piece of broadband infrastructure that will engage Internet Protocol networks, NG911 being one of those networks. Question from good friend John Charamonte. How can the 911 community leverage other cybersecurity initiatives, such as recent announcement of the cybersecurity framework in the White House? John's question is right on point. So I think the answer here is that NG911 is a special type of network, but at the end of the day, it is a IP transport network, right? IP transport networks are very well understood in terms of the potential risk to them, and there's lots of documentation about what those risks are. I would encourage you to do three things to be proactive in this space. The first thing would be, just to reiterate my comment, I would encourage you to engage the NIST Cybersecurity framework and take it upon yourself to run a basic risk analysis, trying to determine what your level of risk is. You know, if that's something that may be too difficult, and quite frankly, I understand how it might be, there are lots of experts in the field that you can connect with, either at the Department of Homeland Security, and we'll make sure to have my information posted, or there's lots of consultants who I'm sure would love to sell you services. But beyond that, I would also encourage you to start looking at the Department of Homeland Security's we basically have a summary of potential known vulnerabilities. So there's something called a common weakness and enumeration database, or common vulnerabilities and enumeration, CVE. This is a database you can readily find, and while I'm talking, I'm going to try and find the actual web address for you. Vulnerability, yeah. So the place where you're going to want to go here is cve.miter.org. And this is an open database that many federal departments and agencies, private sector companies, both vendors and infrastructure providers put information on about what are the known vulnerabilities that are out there to IP infrastructure. So that means they're going to be able to drill down really specifically. So for example, if you're running a Cisco Unified Communications System, they're going to know what the vulnerability was on that system that was exploited, right? They're going to be able to tell you the date that it was done on, that it was reported into the system, and what the potential patches are for you to download. So if your vendor does not send you out patches, or if you are no longer running on SmartNet equipment, for example, for Cisco or something else, in terms of a service contract, you can just download the patches right from the site. It's also a great way for you to be able to do your own risk analysis and look and say, I own this infrastructure. These are the things that I know that I have, and to the extent that I have these things, I should be able to determine my my level of risk. So that website again is cve.miter.org. So Charlie, Victor, Echo, Montana, Indigo, Tango, Rochester, Echo.org. And that would be a good place to start. Are there any other questions we might have from the audience?
Nope, it looks like all the questions at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Kraling. Ms. Doherty will now introduce Ms. Lynn Christel, Executive Director of the Tennessee Emergency Communications Board.
And just also to add my thanks to Alex. I really appreciate your sharing your expertise with this group of people, and look forward to continuing to work on cybersecurity issues with you folks. Lynn will be modest, Lynn Christel, but but what she has been able to accomplish with her team in the state of Tennessee is frankly very impressive, not only in terms of what they've done, but how they've done it. She is the executive director of the Emergency Communications Board for Tennessee, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Lynn.
Well, thanks, Lori. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our program. I'm going to start off with a caveat. I am not technical. I'm a lawyer, and so we're going to talk a little bit about governance and funding as well as the technical aspects. And for your questions, especially those that would be over my head, technically I have Eddie Burchell, who's our Chief of 911 Technical Services with me. So feel free to ask technical questions. Just don't expect me to answer them. If you could turn to the next slide. Governance issues. The Emergency Communications Board that I work for is a 9-member board. It was created in 1998 to assist with the Phase 2 deployment and also to assist in the areas of management, operations, and accountability. We have 100 local emergency communications districts that actually provide 911 service or facilitate it locally, and we're kind of the umbrella organization over that. One of the great things about my board, and one that I would suggest that could help in other states, is that they're 9 members, so it's not too many. They serve for free, but 5 of the 9 members are actually required by law to be 911 folks, to run a PSAP or be on a 911 board. And this has just been key to our planning and deployment because they totally live and breathe 911 every day, and that they get the challenges and are really in tune. If you could change slides, please. So we're administering statewide 911 service. We were involved in assuring that the PSAPs were prepared for Phase 2. We provide funding, and you can see these other things. We provide dispatcher training funding. The board is really a customer-oriented agency, and our customers are basically anyone who's interested in 911, including the public, vendors, and especially the PSAPs. If you could change, please. So just some milestones in our deployment. We were the 3rd state to be Phase 2 ready. We were honored to receive an award as Best State or Regional Program by the E911 Institute, and we are currently deploying a Next Generation 911 project, which we expect to complete in 2016. If you could change the slide. Wanted to talk a little bit about our funding. We've basically been saving for Next Generation 911 since 2006. The way that we were able to do that is our current funding, the board collects a $1 per user subscriber monthly fee on any non-wireline telecommunications service capable of connecting to 911. During the last legislative session, which just ended, the General Assembly changed our funding model. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand where we've been, which is why I'm explaining this. One of the primary foundations of 911 funding in Tennessee was a locally collected 911 fee on landlines. And as everybody knows, the landlines are going away. The fee was maximum $1.50 per line for residential lines and $3 per business lines. One of the important things about our system was that our money by law did not go into the general fund. We were allowed to save money for NG 911. And even though the law required us to give 25% of the funds we took into the districts, we basically have distributed over the years about 60% of the funds we've taken in annually back to the districts. In recurring funds, we spent about 84% of our expenditures in 2013 on district issues, funding for PSAP equipment, especially NG911 equipment. So if you go to the next slide, we had a major landline provider change to VoIP. So that created a huge hole in some districts' budgets last March, not this March, but the March before. And that was really the incentive, I think, to change the 911 funding statute. What they've done is made a revenue neutral uniform rate for all technology, not the differing rates, and our board will be collecting that amount from all the providers. What they meant by revenue neutral, which was really, I think, the political handle that they used, was that this collected no more than was collected throughout the whole system. It's just created a uniform rate. And the districts will be, under this law, receiving a base amount equal to the average of the total recurring annual revenue they received from distributions from our board and the landline fees for fiscal years 2010, 11, and 12, and in no event shall they get less than 2012, which means that they'll be able to expect a check in the same amount basically 6 times a year, gets rid of the uncertainty. And our board will have about $18 million a year to pay for the recurring costs of next generation 911, and we will be definitely dipping into our reserves to complete the project. Next slide, please. So moving into NG911 now. Pre-deployment preparations that we undertook, we had a feasibility study in 2006 that Kimball performed for us. And then in 2006, we also got a law passed that authorized the board to deploy NG911. Very simple language, basically just says it authorizes the administration of deployment of 911 service for emerging technologies, including but not limited to IP-enabled services capable of connecting users, dialing or entering the digits 911 to PSAPs. And that's really all it took to allow us to move ahead with this project. As I said, we started saving in 2006, and at that time we also decided to use a statewide IP network that had been deployed for libraries, e-health, and most importantly for us, for data connecting the NCIC basically. So a lot of the infrastructure already was going to the PSAPs, which was very helpful. AT&T was the state's vendor on that, the NetTN vendor. And the board decided that it wanted to also have a 911 specific contractor to deal with PSAP issues. They also wanted to establish the kind of the one throat to choke. We'd had our current 911 infrastructure before we started doing NG911 had a whole bunch of different owners and a whole bunch of different players in it, and just isolating a problem and understanding and getting problems fixed could be time consuming when time really every second counts with 911. So we set up to get a NOC and also to create our own ALI database so that the districts that had spent so much time creating a GIS mapping system and stuff could dip into a 24/7 by 365 at no cost. So so we've put this team together, and it's worked really well. If you could change to the next slide. Our objectives in setting up this project was to improve reliability. No one is really going to believe you if you say you're doing this to save money. It's possible, I guess, once you've got it deployed that it could save money, but for us anyway, we're a very, very long state, and we had a whole lot of different latitude boundaries and that really were challenging to transfer calls over. So this is set up so that we could actually transfer a whole PSAP if it was taken out. And that's one of the main things. We have automatic failover. And improved communications between PSAPs has been good. We are setting up a system when the system's fully deployed to reroute harassing non-service initialized phones, so they'll kind of go to get out of the PSAPs. Will be able to get those calls out of the PSAPs, and basically the NOC will handle them, so they won't clog up our lines. If you go to the next slide. So NG911 in Tennessee is running on a secure, private, statewide MPLS network. So basically the way it's set up, if you'll go to the next slide, that kind of shows it better than the language. We have two, if you go to the next slide, please. Thanks. Oh, okay. And the next one after that. That's what I was looking for. Thanks. What we have basically is a core of two fully redundant central offices that are in Nashville and Knoxville. When one needs to be maintained or something changed, it can all the traffic can be moved over to the other one. So we have that. And then we have 4 aggregation points, one in Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis, and Chattanooga. And the carriers have to enter into the infrastructure through at least 2 of those for redundancy purposes, but a lot of them are entering in a lot broader way than just through the aggregation centers. And so we have IP routing core, multiple logical VPNs, 10 gigabyte backbone, and if you have questions about that at the end, Eddie will be able to answer them. One of the important things about the setup is that we have service level agreements, and if the core doesn't meet them, then there are consequences to that. So we have basically, I have about 5 conference calls a week about various aspects of the deployment, and that's one of the issues that we talk about every week is meeting the SLAs. So if you could go to the next slide. This is just another picture of our NG911 infrastructure. I thought the presentation before us was really valuable. One of the things that we have done is to require every PSAP to sign a user agreement. That one of the things that it requires is that there can be no connection to the outside internet on our NG911 infrastructure. And we're also toward the tail end of drafting some user agreements with VoIP providers and aggregators. We're about ready to ask for their input, just so that the rules of the road are really clear, that we all have the same expectations about how this will work and what our roles are in it. And once we get those together, we'd be happy to share that with anybody. So just kind of let us know if you want anything that we've got. Really, we are more than happy to share what we've developed. If you could go to the next slide, please. So our plan is at stage 1, we were deploying the core. That's been done, and we've been in the process of developing a statewide GIS mapping system and connecting all the PSAPs. All the wireless carriers that are direct connecting into the infrastructure have already been deployed. And our next stage is going to basically get VoIP and wireline and the ALI database going. We had our first kickoff meeting. We're going to deploy that tandem by tandem. We have 7 tandems here in Tennessee, and we've had one meeting with all the PSAPs that are connected to that tandem to kind of get that going. We will deploy that much like we deployed the wireless, which will have a kickoff call for each PSAP, and so that everyone has the same expectations about what's going to go on. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think we've pretty much talked about all of this stuff. One thing that I really would recommend, though, as far as lessons learned, this Network Operations Center has been incredibly helpful. We are notified, the core team with TCS and AT&T are notified of every blip. I mean, we'll know stuff even when it's not visible in the PSAP. This has just been really helpful for our PSAPs to have one throat to choke and one call to make instead of figuring out what's wrong. And the NOC team helps figure out what's wrong. If you could go to the next. So basically at this point, all of our PSAPs are at some stage of deployment, and I think we have 60 that are operating fully with their wireless calls at an I3 level. Our project to do the GIS map is coming along pretty well. We've developed a website for ESN adjustments. If one district decides that they want to change an ESN boundary, the map won't let them do it if it affects another district until they've talked it over and both agree to it, which has been great to avoid gaps and overlaps in your ESN boundaries. We're at 98% accuracy statewide for the center lines, and we're working on the address points, which is going to be key because that's how we're eventually going to be plotting the calls. We're about at 94% accuracy, but we will get to the goal of 98% surely by August is at the latest. So if you go to the next slide. I think we've already gone over that pretty much. And the next slide, if you will, just kind of talks about our major players. One of the things that I really think that we did and would recommend is having two separate groups working together. There was a little bit of an adjustment time, but AT&T and TCS have been fantastic working together. TCS actually sent the project manager to Nashville to live, and that's been extremely helpful. And the AT&T team is basically on 24/7, making sure that the infrastructure works well. And we've used the state GIS mapping group, and that's worked out well too. With that, that's really about all I have, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, Lynn, I believe there is one question in the Q&A box that was written for you.
Is that since the NINA I3 solution replaces the ALI database, when do you expect that the PSAPs will be able to change the geospatial call routing instructions on the fly? Eddie?
Well, we are in the process of looking and putting together the geospatial database. It's important to note that until all the carriers are ready, we're going to be routing based on a tabular database in the interim. So we're basically replacing the old legacy MSAG with a new MSAG that will be generated off of our GIS map system. And so the XLOST and some of those functions will come into play a little bit further down the road as we get on board with all of the different carriers and make sure that everybody's SOI processes and everything are all in alignment. And as far as the carriers being ready, I just saw that. As far as the carriers being ready, I believe that by the time we are fully deployed at the probably in the latter part of 2016, we'll be ready to push that. We're ready in the core, but again, it's just issue of lining up business processes and getting all the carriers together.
And we have basically we use the same process with the landline carriers and such as we have with the wireless carriers, and they've been incredibly cooperative. And AT&T has a system of reaching out to them, and TCS is also reaching out for the ALI database production purposes. So we've already kind of commenced the outreach, and we've got a long way to go, but we're starting. We got a question from Shawnee from South Dakota. Would we be willing to share slides after the presentation? Certainly. Anything that we can do to assist, we'd be happy to do it.
Our website is www.tn.gov/emergency. You can reach us there, and the contact information is there as well, and we'll be happy to forward out the information that we have.
And we have a lot of deployment information on the website, too.
You can hear some of that working in the background.
All right, I believe that's all the questions we have in queue right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Cristel, and thanks again to Mr. Crayley. And thank you all for attending today's presentation. We look forward to your participation in future State of 911 webinars. The next installment will be Wednesday, July 9th at noon Eastern, with presentations from both state and federal stakeholders. Registration for this event will open up in early June. Again, for more information on the National 911 program or to view a recording of this or past events, please visit our website at www.911.gov. Thanks again.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. You may now disconnect your lines.